Homage to the Triple Gem. So I've been in a bit of a back and forth with a gentleman on YouTube for a couple of months, and it's been a friendly back and forth. This gentleman is respectful in the way that he brought up points, and I think even asking questions. This most recent back and forth that we had, this most recent set, he asked a question at the end, and I thought I would make a video about it because this back and forth that we've been having revolves around this view that's gaining in popularity. And this view has aspects to it that if they're adopted, they can limit the options that people have to basically combat their defilements in ways that are, that can be quite crippling. So I thought that it would be good to address this view. And so before jumping in there, talking about the view, maybe we'll talk a little bit about the format. So actually started recording another video, and was basically just talking about this back and forth that we were having. But listening to it's kind of hard to listen to. He said this, and I said this, and then this is this point, and then this is this point. It doesn't, things can kind of get lost in the weeds in a discussion like that. Although if you're face to face with somebody and having a back and forth, that's the way that you do it, or back and forth in terms of messages. You can get to really refine points in that way. So for the purpose of this video, I thought what I would do is pose some of the major points as questions and then answer the question. And I think that would be a format that would be a little bit easier to listen to than this kind of he said this, I said this format. So let's talk a little bit about this view. So essentially the overarching view, there's going to be other elements that are connected in there, but the one that we're having this back and forth on is that essentially a practitioner should not practice the Satipatthanas until they're at least a noble disciple or at least close to it. And so this criticism of people practicing the Satipatthanas, if they're not a noble disciple or close to it, or getting taught the Satipatthanas right off the bat, seems to be a criticism that's bundled up with meditation. Explicitly, like watching the breath or something like this, various meditation methods, and there's criticism of the meditation methods in there. So we'll probably get to a definition of the Satipatthanas as we go on, but it's enough to say that the argument is that you basically shouldn't practice meditation, formal meditation, until you're a Sotapanna or close to it. So I'll phrase that as a question. Do you think that it's accurate to say, based on the suttas, that you shouldn't practice formal meditation until one is a Sotapanna or close to it? So the answer to that is no. I don't think that is supported by the suttas. And I think that adopting that view would severely limit the number of tools that one has at one's disposal to counter the defilements. So the follow-up question, one of the main points underneath, is that it seems in the canon that the Buddha never taught meditation to lay people, never taught the Satipatthanas to lay people at all. I think that's the point. And so the question is, do you think this is accurate? Or at least, do you think it's accurate that he only taught the Satipatthanas to lay people who were really advanced? So again, no, I don't believe that that's accurate. So there's a standard type of discourse that the Buddha gives to lay people called the graduated discourse. And that graduated discourse, the very last part of it, contains teachings on impermanence, contains teachings on the Four Noble Truths, which are part of the Dhammas portion, essentially, of the Satipatthanas. So that's standard, and he gives that talk many different times. So he does teach the Satipatthanas to lay people. There's another sutta in which Anathapindika shows up with 500 lay people, and the Buddha says you shouldn't just give dana, you should also basically abide in those attainments, essentially, that are peaceful, that are pleasant. Talking about the jhanas, essentially lay people should practice meditation and attain the jhanas, kind of find delight in solitude. So the argument there, or the question there is, well, don't you think that they were all Sotapannas or close? And there's nothing, I wouldn't agree with that. There's nothing in the sutta to indicate that they were all Sotapannas or close. In fact, in the canon, there's nothing to really indicate this point that you should be a Sotapanna or close to practice meditation. It would have these really severe, it would have a serious impact on the way that monks are trained, or in the way that monks train lay people. And so when there's something that's that severe, you would usually expect to see like the Buddha giving really specific advice about it. Here we don't see that. And we don't see anything in the sutta saying that Anathapindika, that all of the lay people who came were all stream enterers. There's another sutta, the most explicit one is there's a sutta with a layman named Pesa who says, we lay people practice the Satipatthanas. He explicitly says it. Satipatthanas are inclusive of breath meditation, inclusive of all the types of meditation that the Buddha recommends. So it's clear enough that lay people were practicing them. So counter question there is, well, don't you think that he was already really advanced and that he's only referring to advanced lay people here? So there's nothing in the sutta to indicate that, and to indicate not necessarily that he wasn't advanced, but that the Buddha would only teach this to advanced lay people. He uses the phrase Gihi Odantavasana, which means that's the phrase that's used for lay people, just the Buddha's lay disciples in general. If we're talking about lay disciples who are keeping the 8 precepts all the time, that's Gihi Odantavasana Brahmacharino. And if they're lay people who aren't keeping the 8 precepts, it's Gihi Odantavasana Kama Bhogino, which means, Bhogino means like eats, essentially. That's related to eating, I believe. So it's kind of like lay people who eat or consume sensuality. So if he was specifically referring to like lay people who had already done a lot of renunciation, and so they should then practice the Satipatthanas, and he was referring to that group, himself included, he would have used this more specific phrase, or more accurately to say the monks who compiled the canon and standardized it at the first council would have put that phrase rather than this other one. All the suttas that we have been standardized from the first council. So that sutta makes it totally clear that the Buddha taught the Satipatthanas meditation to lay people, and that there's no distinction that he's making, that they should be really advanced lay people. So that is actually an inference based on looking at patterns that people might see in the canon, and it's not supported by the suttas. I would argue that that's an incorrect inference. So follow-up question, or another question based on this is, the Satipatthanas, they have this refrain that comes at the end of each of the portions in one section of the sutta, the whole sutta. So the refrain is, he abides or he dwells contemplating the body, or focusing on the body in and of itself. He abides or dwells, focusing on origination and passing away with regards to the body. Or he abides just with the bare knowledge, essentially, that there is the body, remaining unattached to anything in the world. So the argument is, well, look here, when they're talking about the Satipatthanas, they're saying, unattached to anything in the world. That's obviously a really advanced state. Do you think, so Foza as a question, do you think that's accurate to say then, that an accurate interpretation? So my answer would be no, I don't think that's an accurate interpretation, because in that formula, the Buddha uses the word or. He abides, basically dwelling, focused on the body in and of itself, or he abides focused on the phenomenon of origination and passing away with regards to the body, or he abides basically just with the knowledge there is a body, only to the extent needed to maintain mindfulness, and to the extent of mindfulness, and he abides unattached to anything in the world. So you've got this or in between these. So what we see in the Satipatthanas Sutta is this gradation of development in the Satipatthanas Sutta. So you can practice them at a level that's more coarse, and it becomes progressively more refined. So let's just jump in there right now a little bit of an aside to clarify the meaning of the word Satipatthanas. So the Buddha has these different teachings that you can almost call like complete teachings, where they're a teaching that essentially encompasses everything in the world. So he teaches about the 5 aggregates, that's the whole world. And he teaches about the 6 sense bases, that's basically the whole world. He teaches about the Satipatthanas, And the Satipatthanas are essentially another way of talking about the aggregates or talking about the whole world, but seen through the perspective of the Dhamma, using categories of the Dhamma in which to view the world, or in which to view the universe in such a way that it can lead the mind to release. So you've got form, the body, that correlates to physical form, and the contemplations have all the types of physical form in there. You've got feelings, that correlates to feelings. You've got the mind, kind of correlates to consciousness. You've got the Dhammas, which correlate to perceptions and mental formations. Both of those are in there. And there's also concentration in the Dhammas section as well. So essentially, you've got everything in the world there. The Buddha lays out these 4 Satipatthanas as ways you can focus on any of these categories, which is the way he breaks the world up, breaks the universe up, in such a way that you can develop the mind towards dispassion. So there's a sutta in which the Buddha says that if he had 2 disciples with basically excellent memory, and they asked him questions about the Satipatthanas, or 4, I think it was 4 actually, 4 disciples maybe, they asked him questions about the Satipatthanas, one after the other, and it went on for 100 years, and they never repeated themselves, never repeated the same question. He could answer them for 100 years, and he wouldn't run out of things to say. And they wouldn't necessarily run out of questions. The topic of the Satipatthanas is that vast. So it's vast in the sense because there's so many different ways that you can apply the mind underneath the umbrellas of these topics that the Buddha's given to eliminate defilements, to reduce unwholesome qualities and increase wholesome ones. So that's the general meaning of the one of the general ways we can look at Satipatthanas. And one takes these things, Satipattana essentially means an establishing of mindfulness. One takes them as the object of one's mindfulness. So mindfulness means the ability to keep something in mind. So you take up form, one of the ways of focusing on form, and you take that up essentially as your lens through which you interact with the universe. And if you're taking up a subha kammatthana, then you're always looking at things through the lens of your body. You try to make that the main focus, or other people's bodies. And, how it's impermanent, it's going to break apart, it's disgusting. And you learn to essentially use that as your lens for the world. Or if it's the breath, if it's feelings, you're going through the day using that as your foundation of mindfulness, as your establishment of mindfulness. And it's not to say that you can only do one. You can pull in others as well. So that's the meaning of the Satipatthanas. That's one of the ways we can talk about the Satipatthanas. And as you develop in the Satipatthanas, there's going to be a gradation to that. When you start off focusing in on the breath, there's quite a lot of activity in there, thinking in terms of like me and mine. It's kind of very coarse. You're just focusing on the breath in and of itself, kind of focusing on the in-breath coming in and out, or focusing on learning to relax the body. As you're doing this with a purpose, which is to make the mind calm, which is to eliminate your suffering, whether it's the breath or a subha kammatthana or whatever it might be, you're doing it with the purpose of eliminating your suffering. So the more that you try to use these topics to actually eliminate your suffering, the more you see the cause and effect relationship between the way that attaching to things leads to suffering and the way that relinquishing attachment eliminates suffering. You see this in the context of your practice of the Satipatthanas. So you're feeling all kinds of lust, you're feeling worried about your body, you apply this perception of a subha, you're applying this perception of not self, and your attachment to the body lessens as a result. Your infatuation with the beauty of other people's bodies lessens, and you can see for yourself in practicing this way how desire for other people's bodies arises, desire for your own body arises, and how it passes away. So the more that a person does this, the more they actively try to eliminate the things that cause them to suffer, the more that they can learn about origination and passing away with regards to this particular Satipattana, the body. So you remain focused on it in and of itself, using it as your frame of reference. It leads into this perceptions of arising and passing away of suffering. The very last part, the or, he maintains the perception basically that there is this body just to the extent of mindfulness and remains unattached to anything in the world. For some meditators at the penultimate level of their meditation before a noble attainment, say, they essentially have let go of everything else in the world, but they're still hanging on to this Satipatthaana, this kind of, they're just maintaining it to the extent of mindfulness, and their perceptions of the world beyond that is just suffering arising, suffering passing away, suffering arising, suffering passing away. So there's this development process that can happen in terms of the Satipatthanas. So it doesn't necessarily mean because there's this phrase, which is separated by or, that it's only for they're only to be used at this really advanced state. They're to be used as a tool to develop towards advanced states and towards the dispassion that can bring one past attachment to anything in the world. So, no, I wouldn't agree with that statement that this is some kind of proof that the Satipatthanas should only be practiced by people who are really advanced on the path. In fact, I interpret that statement to mean you should practice it to become advanced on the path. So, one of the last points in this back and forth, there's I guess two more, is about the gradual training. So I'll jump in there with the gradual training. So the Buddha's given teachings on the gradual training that, basically first a monk practices virtue, and the gradual training is slightly different in different suttas, and then he might practice restraint over food, moderation in eating, or practice restraint of the senses, practice devotion to wakefulness, which means basically sleeping 4 hours and then meditating the whole day. Practice mindfulness and clear comprehension, being always mindful when you go forward and back, then resort to seclusion. And then practice meditation and gain the jhanas. So the arguments that is put forth is that, okay, look, there's this gradual training. You shouldn't practice meditation until you've done all these other things. So the question I could put forward to that is, or the hypothetical question is, do you agree with this statement? Do you agree that the gradual training is saying that you basically shouldn't practice the next step until you've totally mastered the first? So I would disagree with that, actually. And I don't think that the suttas on the gradual training are meant to be a categorical teaching of the Buddha. So the Buddha, he says there's I think two types of people who slander him. There's basically one who says that a teaching that's categorical is a teaching that the meaning needs to be drawn out, and a teaching that the meaning needs to be drawn out is categorical. So categorical teachings means no ifs, ands, or buts about it. So one of the categorical teachings of the Buddha is that bad action shouldn't be done. Right? So categorically, you shouldn't do bad actions. Categorically, you should do good actions by body, speech, or mind, as far as I remember. So these are categorical teachings. There's no teaching where the Buddha says you should do evil. It's kind of, you should always do good. The suttas are generally not like a scientific manual. And one of the issues that's happened historically when a religion comes to the West or so is that all the teachings in it are interpreted almost categorically. Teachings that aren't necessarily meant to be categorical are interpreted categorically. So one of them, apparently, that happened in Christianity, maybe some Christian scholars who listen to this who could correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I remember reading is that, in the early phases of Christianity, Jesus was said to be the Son of God, and it was meant to be like a reference that he had a special relationship with God, like his son. But it was essentially taken to be like a literal thing by later theologians. And then they had to come up with, a whole doctrine on how God could be the exact same as his son. Because they later said Jesus was God, basically. So, essentially there can be this danger of taking a statement that's meant to be poetic, or not meant to be categorical, and making it a categorical statement. So there's a few different ways you can tell that this statement about the gradual training is not meant to be categorical. For one, when monks ordain, they're taught meditation as part of the ordination ceremony. So monks have to recite Kesa, Loma, Naka, Danta, Tacho, and then back in reverse order. So that is a Subhakamatana. That's part of the Satipatthanas. It's part of the contemplation of the body. And monks are taught that as part of their ordination ceremony. So you get a meditation topic right when you ordain. So it's pretty clear that the Buddha did not only mean that for advanced people, because not every monk, very few will be advanced when they ordain. They're ordaining to train. Another one is that there's a sutta called the Undakawinda Sutta, which is directed to new monks. And in that sutta, the Buddha advises Ananda that he should rouse and encourage monks in being restrained in virtue in the patimokkha, that he should encourage them to speak little, that he should encourage them to be restrained in their senses, that he should encourage them to resort to seclusion, and that he should encourage them to have right view. So he doesn't lay that out as a chronological thing where first you encourage them to virtue, then you encourage them to this. He's encourage them to do these things. And practically speaking, that is how monks are trained. Because think about what it would mean if you had to basically train a monk or train anybody, and you were supposed to focus on virtue only and then not focus on moderation in eating, not focus on sense restraint, until you've mastered virtue. So monks have 227 rules and thousands of other ones. In these gradual trainings, the Buddha recommends basically becoming consummate in virtue. That's one of the first things. So, what's that mean for a monk? Should you be totally fluent in every aspect of the rules? It takes a really long time. Before you start restraining yourself, like if a young monk goes out on the street, should he not restrain himself when he sees a pretty woman, when he sees some expensive goods, when he sees somebody doing the profession that he used to do? Should he not practice restraint of the senses until he's fully mastered virtue? Or, should he just, if he hasn't, learned the rules fully enough, should he then go and eat whatever he wants at the table and just kind of at the dana just take as much as he wants of anything? Further to that, it's assumed in the Vinaya that monks will break the rules of the Vinaya from time to time. So the Vinaya is there, so they lay out ways in which you can correct yourself after you've broken a rule. So, there's some serious ones. There's the parajikas. If you break those, you're out of the monastic order. There's sanghadisesas. Those are really heavy rules. Goes down, there's pachityas. And each of them have a way that you can correct it. Now, in none of those ways of correcting it does the Buddha say that you should now stop practicing meditation or stop practicing the Satipatthanas, go back to virtue. You haven't mastered it fully. It's not, you haven't made it a foundation for yourself yet. It's not stable. So you shouldn't move on. And by the way, stop, nobody's, there's nothing there that says stop practicing sense restraint. Don't restrain yourself anymore when you go out into town. Just look all over the place and, and when you get a dana, just eat as much as you want until you've, corrected this thing. It'd be a ludicrous way to try to train, and clearly one that wouldn't work well. Another problem with that is, how do you know when you've mastered virtue enough to move to the next step? How do you know when you've mastered moderation in eating enough to move to sense restraint? How do you know when you've mastered sense restraint? That goes really deep in order to move on to devotion to wakefulness and practicing meditation all day and night, essentially. That's another point, that this devotion to wakefulness includes this practicing meditation. So the Buddha was very skilled teacher, and if this were really a categorical teaching, it would significantly impact the way that people were trained. Young monks, lay people, everybody. It would be a really significant impact. And so you would expect to see more teachings from him on how to determine when you should go to the next step. And especially you'd expect to see injunctions. It would need to be addressed essentially in cases where monks break serious rules, because then what should you do? Should you stop meditating? So we don't see any of that. And so what this points to is that the teaching on the gradual training is not a categorical one where first you must do this. You cannot move on to the next, and you cannot move on to the next until you've finished this particular step. So that brings me to, I think, the last point that I'll discuss here, and one of the last points which he made, which I'll turn into a question, which is that he felt that one of the points was that modern meditation methods, like say just focusing on the breath or going back to awareness or whatever it might be, those are essentially escaping, like they're running away from your problems, and you're not gaining any insight into, the development of wholesome qualities, the elimination of unwholesome ones through the practice of these meditation techniques. So I'll phrase that as a question. Do you agree that it's the case that meditation techniques, modern ones, focusing on the breath or whatever, are things that are like an escape, like almost like a drug or a blanking out or an avoidance or an escape from the problem or a distraction from the problem of suffering? And so no, I don't agree with that either. I think that's false. So there is an intimate connection between the ability to focus the mind and virtue. And the Buddha essentially makes this clear, is that virtue fortifies concentration, concentration fortifies discernment. So these things are all connected. It's also the case that, these elements, they feed back into one another with their connections. So virtue, if you're not virtuous and you try to practice meditation, your meditation does not go well. So somebody who's practicing meditation, they will notice, they'll notice more acutely times when their virtue slips. I remember when I was a young man, first started practicing meditation, and I was, living a kind of a little bit of an immoral life in high school before that. I was a high school student when I first started to practice meditation. And, wanted to change. So noticed that meditation was helping so much with focus. It was helping me gain the discipline necessary to, stop drinking, stop doing drugs, and other things, stop lying, the basic 5 precepts. Meditation was helping with that. Noticed that when I try to train myself to focus just to stay with the breath, that made it easier to focus on homework afterwards. And what you think about, what are you doing when you're training your mind to stay with the breath? You're training it to be focused on one thing. You're training it to do what you say. Focus on this, and it obeys. You're kind of just going around looking at things all the time. You're essentially letting it run wild, and that's how you're training it. So this was a big help for me in developing virtue. Now, something happened later, which was that, there was these kids who came to my school and beat up my friends. And, there was this kind of back and forth that had been happening between, I guess you could say, people, at least one young guy from our group and another young guy from their group. And that kind of spilled out, came to our school, and they kind of beat up my friends. So, at that time we were thinking, I was kind of adamant that we should get revenge and we should go and, beat them up or do something to them. But notice very clearly that whenever I developed this thought, and we have like meetings, we should meet, and this is the plan, discussing these kind of meetings, it was impossible to meditate after that. Kind of just the meditation, you can say impossible. The meditation was not really going well. These benefits that seemed to come from meditation seemed to be falling away. So knew that it basically saw that if I wanted to continue getting the benefits from meditation, then I couldn't be, developing this attitude of harming, developing this attitude of wanting to, punch people or beat them up or whatever it might be. So there's an intimate connection between meditation, practice of meditation, and virtue. And both of them feed back into one another. If you are virtuous, then it feeds into your meditation. If you meditate, that can feed into your efforts to develop your virtue better, to become more sensitive to when you're doing something immoral or something moral. It can also feed into your ability to focus enough to study the various rules. So it's not an escape. You can't think that you're going to murder people and then go on a meditation retreat and just escape. That doesn't really work that way, You're going to have a pretty rough meditation retreat, and you're probably going to want to leave it. Your meditation is not really going to go well. So it's not an escape. It's not like doing drugs or, distracting yourself with TV or something like this. It's not something you can really use to run away from your problems so much. Because when you sit there with the mind focusing on the breath, or another topic that the Buddha's recommended, you're there with your mind. And you're there with these thoughts that come up, remorse or whatever it might be, over bad things that you've done. And the intention to do bad things blocks further progress in meditation. It's kind of can block further progress in meditation. It's a wrong intention, which is the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path. So just to wrap everything up, to bring everything together, if a person develops this view that They shouldn't practice meditation until they've totally mastered virtue. They're cutting themselves off from a number of different tools that work synergistically together to develop wholesome qualities and abandon unwholesome ones. One should practice virtue, but at the same time, one can practice moderation in eating. One can practice restraining the senses. One can practice meditating most of the day. And these things all can feed together into one's efforts to stop the things that cause one to suffer. And practicing in this way and making efforts to stop the things that cause one to suffer, here being your attachments, one does gain this knowledge of cause and effect through that effort, through trying to find practical ways to eliminate the bad qualities in one's mind using meditation, using sense restraint, using moderation in eating, using virtue. All these things feed into one's knowledge of cause and effect, of what causes suffering and what brings it to an end. So meditation is a very important part of the path, and one that should not be assumed is only for people who are very advanced. It's by developing meditation. It's a tool to help you become more advanced. So the Buddha gives this phrase frequently, and again does not limit that phrase to people who are Sotapannas or close to it or higher. That phrase is Jayata Bhikkhave, which means meditate bhikkhus. Don't be negligent, don't regret it later. This is our advice to you. That's what the Buddha said. So our practice is something that we can look at holistically, not in a linear fashion necessarily, like just virtue, then just, you've got to develop virtue before you develop this and this and this. We can look at it as something like a feedback loop, something that we can turn into a virtuous cycle, so that our practice using these Satipatthanas can build ever higher from the basic, using them as a foundation of mindfulness, to seeing cause and effect, to just being aware of suffering and stress passing away, and to going beyond, to the ending of fetters. And in this way, the practice of the Satipatthanas can lead us from the basic level. The practice of meditation, can, along with virtue and everything else, can lead us from the most basic levels to the highest, to the elimination of fetters and to Nibbana.